Two officers on a routine patrol spotted a man walking through a troubled neighborhood. To them, he seems out of place. Their suspicion quickly turns into confrontation, their words laced with venom, and their actions escalating into something shocking, an act of cruelty that leaves the man with a burn on his hand and the crowd around him stunned. But they don't realize that the man they've humiliated isn't just another passerby. He's their new boss, the incoming captain of their precinct. What follows is a battle of wills, a fight for accountability, and a quest to transform a broken system. Before we dive into this intense and powerful story of justice, redemption, and change, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this gripping tale of courage and integrity resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's next. The train screeched to a halt, its brakes protesting as it approached the station. Through the smudged windows, the sprawling skyline of Maple Creek came into view. From a distance, the city's shimmering steel and glass towers seemed majestic, a beacon of modern ambition. But as the train drew closer, the cracks in this facade revealed themselves. Graffiti-streaked walls, alleys overflowing with garbage, and shadows darting between buildings in a desperate dance of survival. Jonathan Miller adjusted his tie, a gesture of habit rather than necessity. His dark, tailored suit carried the sharp creases of a man accustomed to order, his polished shoes gleaming despite the wear of travel. At his lapel, a silver pin caught the morning sunlight, a star encircled by a laurel, understated but unmistakable. It marked him not just as a professional, but a man of authority. As the train stopped, the intercom buzzed to life. "Welcome to Maple Creek Central Station," the voice announced mechanically and differently. Jonathan rose with deliberate precision, his tall, commanding frame unfolding as he collected his suitcase and briefcase. He stepped onto the crowded platform, a sea of people moving with urgency, their conversations and footsteps merging into the city's chaotic symphony. The station buzzed with energy, yet something unspoken hung heavy. Maple Creek was not just alive, it was restless. Jonathan felt the weight of it, the palpable tension of a city teetering on the edge. Out on the street, he hailed a taxi. The driver, a middle-aged man with streaks of gray in his hair, gave him a cursory glance before nodding. "Where to, sir?" he asked with a tone of mild curiosity. "Elton Precinct," Jonathan replied firmly, placing his luggage beside him. The driver's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The police precinct," he clarified, his voice betraying surprise and unease. Jonathan nodded. "Well, good luck, Captain," the driver said, a faint note of pity in his voice as he pulled into traffic. As the cab navigated the city, the driver spoke unprompted, his words tumbling out in a weary monologue. "Been driving these streets for 30 years and used to be a decent place. Sure, it had its problems, but it wasn't like this. Now, corruption in the precinct, gangs running wild, protests every week. It's a mess. And the cops? Half of them are just as bad as the criminals." Jonathan listened silently, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the streets rushing past the window. "You from around here, Captain?" the driver asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "No," Jonathan replied curtly, "but I'm here to fix it." The driver chuckled dryly, a sound devoid of humor. "Fix it, huh? Well, you've got your work cut out for you." As they entered the Elton district, the precinct's jurisdiction, the scenery changed. Buildings grew older, their facades weathered by years of neglect. Boarded-up storefronts lined the streets, and groups of young men loitered on corners, their gazes sharp and watchful. Despite the decay, minor signs of resilience peeked through. Children playing hopscotch on cracked sidewalks, vendors selling snacks from makeshift carts. The cab stopped in front of the precinct, a gray stone building that loomed over the street like an indifferent sentinel. Jonathan stepped out, paying the driver, who offered a parting glance that could have been encouragement or resignation. Jonathan stood at the base of the precinct's steps, taking a moment to absorb the weight of the task ahead. The air was heavy, not just with the stale smell of the city, but with the sense of a place resistant to change. He had seen challenges on battlefields and boardrooms before, but this was different. Here, he wasn't just up against corruption or crime, he was up against perception, prejudice, and a deeply entrenched system. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere could have been more welcoming. The dim fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the linoleum floors, which were scuffed and dull from years of neglect. The air reeked of stale coffee and sweat, a cocktail of exhaustion and apathy. Officers moved about in varying states of haste, their murmured conversations punctuated by the occasional bark of laughter. Few noticed Jonathan as he entered, and those who did offer only fleeting glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. At the front desk, a young officer with sandy hair barely looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "I'm Captain Miller," Jonathan replied, his voice even but firm. "Here to assume command." The officer froze, his pen hovering mid-air. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as they took in Jonathan's imposing figure. Welcome, Captain," the officer stammered. "The chief's expecting you." Jonathan nodded and approached the chief's office, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. Conversation ceased as he passed, heads turning, whispers trailing in his wake. "Is that him?" someone murmured. "The new guy? He won't last long," another voice muttered, low but audible. Jonathan knocked once on the chief's door before entering. Behind the desk sat Chief Donner, a stout man with thinning hair and a face deeply lined with stress. He rose to greet Jonathan, extending a hand. "Captain Miller," Donner said, his tone gruff but cordial. "Welcome to Maple Creek." "Thank you, Chief," Jonathan replied, shaking his hand firmly. Donner gestured for Jonathan to sit. "I won't sugarcoat it," he began, leaning back in his chair. "This precinct is a mess. Morale is in the gutter, trust is non-existent. And the community? They hate us. You've got your work cut out for you." Jonathan's expression remained unreadable. "I expected nothing less," he replied. The following conversation outlined the challenges ahead. Officers entrenched in bad habits, a community alienated by years of neglect, and an overwhelming distrust. As Jonathan left the chief's office, he felt the weight of his new role settles onto his shoulders like a familiar but heavy coat. This precinct was a battleground, and the fight was just beginning. The streets of the Elton district were a mix of chaos and routine. Vendors shouted over one another, selling everything from counterfeit goods to greasy street food. Children darted between parked cars, their laughter echoing off the weathered brick facades of the surrounding buildings. Yet, beneath the surface vibrancy, there was an undeniable tension, a sharp edge to the air that made every movement feel cautious. Now clad in his dark suit, Jonathan Miller chose to walk through the neighborhood rather than drive. It was an intentional decision. He wanted to immerse himself in the community he was here to serve, to feel its pulse, even if it meant standing out like a beacon amidst the worn casual attire of the locals. His imposing frame and polished demeanor drew glances, some curious, others hostile, but he continued, his expression calm, his stride purposeful. As Jonathan turned a corner, his steps slowed. Ahead, two uniformed officers stood beside their patrol car, their postures far too casual for men on duty. The taller of the two, a stocky man with a square jaw and a perpetual scowl, leaned against the car, a cigarette perched on his lips. His name tag read Sergeant Baker. The other officer, Tom Reed, was leaner and younger, his movements restless, as though he were searching for an excuse to be elsewhere. It didn't take long for Baker to notice Jonathan, his sharp gaze locked on to the newcomer, narrowing with suspicion. Reed, catching sight of Jonathan as well, quickly looked away, his unease evident in how he shifted from foot. "Hey, you!" Baker's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Jonathan stopped, his expression unchanging as he turned to face the two officers. "Yes," he replied evenly. "You live around here?" Baker asked, his tone carrying a deliberate note of challenge. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze meeting Baker's. "I don't see how that's relevant." Baker pushed himself off the car, his cigarette dangling dangerously close to its filter. He stepped toward Jonathan, his size meant to intimidate. "It's relevant when someone's wandering around like they don't belong. Let's see some ID." Jonathan's jaw tightened gradually, but he kept his composure. "Is there a reason for the stop, officer?" "Yeah," Baker smirked, the expression dripping with mockery. "Suspicious behavior?" The exchange had begun to attract attention. Passers-by slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued. A small group started to form, their murmurs filling the space with a quiet hum of anticipation. Aware of every pair of eyes on him, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Baker snatched the ID card exaggeratedly, inspecting it as though expecting to find some incriminating detail. "Jonathan Miller," he drawled, emphasizing the name as though testing its weight. "So what do you do, Mr. Miller?" Jonathan's response was measured, his voice steady. "That's Captain Miller," he corrected, "and what I do is none of your concern." For a moment, Baker faltered, caught off guard by the response, but he quickly recovered, his smirk returning, this time more venomous. "Captain? Huh? Military or something?" "Something like that," Jonathan replied. Baker took another step closer, now well within Jonathan's personal space. The cigarette dangled precariously from his lips. "Well, Captain, you're in our neighborhood now. We call the shots here." Behind him, Reed shifted nervously, his discomfort growing as the exchange escalated. "Maybe we should just quiet," Baker snapped without turning. Reed closed his mouth, his jaw tightening as he looked away. Jonathan remained still, his posture calm but unyielding. The silence stretched thick with tension. Finally, Baker broke it with a sneer. "You think you're something special, don't you?" Without waiting for a response, Baker took the cigarette from his lips. In a deliberate, calculated motion, he pressed the smoldering end against the back of Jonathan's hand. A sharp hiss filled the air, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. Jonathan's body tensed, but he didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on Baker, steady and unyielding. Baker's smirk faltered as the gravity of his actions began to sink in. Jonathan looked down at the burn on his hand, then back at Baker. His voice, when he spoke, was low but firm, carrying the weight of authority. "You're going to regret that." For a moment, Baker seemed unsure of himself. But then, with a forced laugh, he stepped back. "Yeah, we'll see about that." Jonathan calmly retrieved his ID card from Baker's hand, turned, and walked away without another word. The crowd parted for him, their expressions a mix of admiration and concern. Some whispered, and others stared as he disappeared down the street. Baker leaned against his desk at the precinct, recounting the encounter to a small group of officers. His tone was mocking, and his audience laughed along with him. "You should have seen him," Baker said, grinning. "Standing there all high and mighty. Had to knock him down a peg." One of the officers chuckled. "Did he fight back?" "Not a chance," Baker replied with satisfaction. Walked away like a good little boy. Nearby, Reed sat silently, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a report. He finally glanced up, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe we shouldn't have." "Don't start," Baker snapped. "You're either with me or you're not." Reed looked away, his expression conflicted. He knew he was too deep, and climbing out wouldn't be easy. Later that evening, Jonathan sat in his temporary apartment, staring at his bandaged hand. The burn throbbed, but his thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the day's events. He clenched his fist, the pain grounding him. "Tomorrow," he murmured, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Tomorrow, they'll understand." The sun rose over Maple Creek, casting pale light across the streets of the Elton district. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, delivery trucks rumbled by, and early commuters shuffled toward bus stops. Inside the precinct, the morning began as any other. Officers moved between desks, conversations blending with the clatter of keyboards and the shuffle of papers. Yet an unusual tension hung in the air, a quiet undercurrent of anticipation. The atmosphere shifted when Jonathan Miller walked through the precinct's front doors. Conversations halted, heads turned, and whispers followed in his wake. Some officers looked at him with curiosity, others with open skepticism. Jonathan's posture was erect, his expression unreadable. He carried himself with an air of quiet authority that demanded attention. At the front desk, a young officer looked up nervously. "Captain Miller," Jonathan said evenly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Yes, sir," the officer stammered, standing so quickly that his chair nearly toppled over. "Chief Donner is expecting you. His office is down the hall." Jonathan nodded and proceeded through the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. As he passed, officers parted to let him through. Some offered stiff nods, while others avoided his gaze entirely. The air was thick with unspoken judgments, but Jonathan remained composed, his focus unshaken. The gruff, weathered man gestured for Jonathan to sit in Chief Donner's office. "Morning, Captain," Donner said, his tone neutral but weighted. "Morning, Chief," Jonathan replied, taking a seat. Donner leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "I won't sugarcoat things, Miller. This precinct's a powder keg. Morale's in the gutter. The community doesn't trust us, and some of the officers, they've been operating without accountability for far too long. I've seen the files, Jonathan said, calm but resolute. I'm here to change that. Donner sighed, rubbing his temple. I respect that. But be careful. There are some officers here who won't take kindly to change. Especially Baker. Sergeant Baker, Jonathan repeated, his tone neutral but probing. Donner nodded grimly. Been here for years. He knows the ropes, knows the people, and knows how to push boundaries without breaking them, at least not on paper. He's got influence, and he's not afraid to use it. And his partner? Reed? Young, impressionable. He's been following Baker's lead, for better or worse. If you're looking for loyalty, it's probably not with them. Jonathan filed the information away, his resolve hardening. Understood. By mid-morning, Jonathan had gathered the entire precinct in the briefing room. Officers filtered in slowly, their expressions ranging from neutral to openly defiant. Sergeant Baker entered last, his smug grin firmly in place. Behind him trailed Reed, his shoulders hunched, his gaze flickering nervously around the room. Jonathan stood at the front, his gaze sweeping across the room. He let the silence settle, commanding attention without a word. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and clear. Good morning. I'm Captain Jonathan Miller, and I am in command of this precinct as of today. The room remained silent, though Jonathan could feel the undercurrent of resistance in the air. I've been brought here to address the issues that have plagued this precinct for far too long, he continued. Let me be clear, my priority is to restore trust within this department and with the community we serve. Baker shifted in his seat, his smirk growing wider. Sounds like a tall order, he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. Jonathan's eyes flicked to Baker, his expression calm but unyielding. It is. But I've never shied away from a challenge. The tension in the room thickened. Baker leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his posture oozing defiance. With all due respect, Captain, what makes you think you can do what no one else could? Jonathan met Baker's gaze directly. Because I don't just demand change, I lead by example. For a fleeting moment, Baker's smirk faltered. But he quickly recovered his expression once again, one of feigned indifference. Jonathan turned his attention back to the group. I'm not here to play favorites. I'm here to make this precinct better. That means accountability, discipline, and respect for each other and the people out there. He gestured toward the window, where the hum of the city filtered through. They're counting on us, whether they trust us or not. It's our job to earn that trust back. The room remained silent as the officers processed his words. Some exchanged skeptical glances, while others sat with arms crossed, their expressions guarded. As the meeting concluded, the officers began to file out. Baker lingered near the door, watching Jonathan with a calculating gaze. This is going to be fun, he muttered to Reed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What do you think, rookie? Baker asked, clapping Reed on the back. Think our new captain has what it takes? Reed hesitated, his expression conflicted. I think he's serious. Baker laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Serious doesn't mean anything in this place, kid. He'll learn that soon enough. Jonathan reviewed files and reports in his office, and his focus was unwavering. The burn on his hand, now bandaged, throbbed faintly, a physical reminder of the encounter on the street. He flexed his fingers, the pain grounding him. He knew Baker and others like him would be obstacles. But obstacles could be overcome. This wasn't just about cleaning up a precinct. It was about setting a standard, proving that integrity could stand firm even in the face of resistance. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the precinct's logo painted on the wall. The battle was just beginning. The precinct hummed with its usual rhythm, though the tension was palpable. Jonathan Miller's arrival had disrupted the status quo, and the officers who thrived under the old system were less than subtle in their defiance. Among them, Sergeant Baker stood out as the most vocal and bold, his every word and action laced with the smug confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Baker's disdain wasn't confined to whispers or sidelong glances. He did not try to hide his sarcasm during briefings or disregard for the captain's directives. Around him, a small group of officers gravitated, feeding off his cynicism. While most of the precinct's staff kept their heads down, unwilling to get involved, a few began to watch Jonathan with cautious hope, curious to see if he would follow through on his promises of accountability. Among them was Officer Tom Reed, Baker's reluctant partner. Reed was young and still finding his footing in the chaotic environment of the precinct. The conflict between Baker and Jonathan placed him in an uncomfortable position. Though Reed admired Jonathan's resolve, he was wary of openly aligning himself against Baker, whose influence was deeply entrenched. One afternoon, as Jonathan worked through a stack of incident reports in his office, a knock at the door interrupted him. "Come in," he called, not looking up as he signed off on a document. Reed entered, his posture uncertain. "Captain Miller?" Jonathan glanced up, studying the young officer for a moment. "Officer Reed, what can I do for you?" Reed hesitated, shifting his weight. "I wanted to apologize for what happened the other day with Baker." Jonathan raised a hand, cutting him off. "You don't need to explain. I know you weren't the one leading that situation." Reed's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his unease remained. "It's just, he's been here a long time. A lot of people look up to him. And do you?" Jonathan asked, his tone even, but probing. Reed's gaze dropped to the floor. "I don't know. He knows the neighborhood. He's done some good things, but—" Jonathan leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Let me give you some advice, Officer Reed. Leadership isn't about how long you've been in a place or how loud your voice is. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Reed nodded, though his expression betrayed lingering uncertainty. Jonathan let him leave without further comment, recognizing that trust couldn't be built in a single conversation. A few days later, a call came into the precinct about an armed robbery at a convenience store. Jonathan observed from the command center as dispatch sent Baker and Reed to the scene. Listening in on the radio communications, Jonathan noticed something troubling. Baker's tone was far too casual for the gravity of the situation, and the details he relayed to dispatch were vague. Deciding to intervene, Jonathan grabbed his jacket and headed to the scene. When he arrived, the store clerk, a wiry man in his 50s, gestured animatedly to Baker, his frustration evident. "I told you. There were two of them. They came in with masks and a gun, but they ran when another customer walked in." Baker leaned lazily against the counter, scribbling in his notebook without much interest. Yeah, and I'm telling you, they're long gone. Nothing we can do now but file the report." Reed stood a few feet away, his notebook in hand, though he hadn't written much. His gaze flicked between Baker and the increasingly agitated clerk. Jonathan's presence shifted the atmosphere as soon as he walked in. Baker straightened slightly but maintained his casual demeanor. "Captain," he drawled, "didn't think you'd join us for this little neighborhood drama." Ignoring the bait, Jonathan turned to the clerk. "Sir, can you walk me through what happened again? I want to make sure we don't miss anything." Bookmark. The man launched into his story again, and Jonathan listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. By the time the clerk finished, it was clear that Baker had omitted key details in his initial report. Jonathan turned to Baker, his tone calm but firm. "Why didn't you mention the second suspect?" Baker shrugged, his smirk unwavering. "Didn't seem relevant. They're gone. Doesn't matter how many there were." "Every detail matters, Sergeant," Jonathan replied, his voice steady. "We're here to do our job, not make assumptions." Baker's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, feigning indifference. "Sure thing, Captain." Back at the precinct, Jonathan called Reed into his office. The young officer hesitated at the door before stepping in, his nervousness palpable. Jonathan gestured for him to sit, studying him briefly before speaking. "You've been Baker's partner for a while now," he began. "What do you think of how he handled today's call?" Reed shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "He knows the area," he said cautiously. "He's been here a lot longer than I have." "That's not what I asked," Jonathan said. "I want your assessment." Reed hesitated, then sighed. "He takes shortcuts sometimes, says it's more efficient." Jonathan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "And do you agree?" Reed looked down at his hands. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," Jonathan said quietly. "You just don't want to say it." Reed's head snapped up, startled by the observation. Jonathan's gaze was steady but not unkind. "This isn't about throwing anyone under the bus, officer. It's about doing what's right. If we let things slide, we're no better than the people we're supposed to protect this city from." Reed nodded slowly, though his uncertainty lingered. As he left the office, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. Reed was still finding his way, but had potential and a desire to improve, and needed the right guidance. Later that evening, Baker orchestrated his next move. During a routine patrol, he suggested that Jonathan join him and Reed, framing it as an opportunity for the captain to see the streets firsthand. The call they responded to was about a suspicious individual loitering near an abandoned warehouse. When they arrived, the scene was eerily quiet. The suspect, a wiry teenager with a backpack, stood near the entrance, his posture defensive. "What are you doing here, kid?" Baker demanded, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. The boy stammered, trying to explain that he was waiting for a friend. Baker didn't let him finish. He grabbed the backpack, dumping its contents onto the ground. Books and a half-eaten sandwich spilled out, clearly not the tools of a criminal. "That's enough," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the tension. Baker turned, feigning innocence. "Just doing my job, Captain." "No," Jonathan replied firmly. "You're making a spectacle. Let him go." As Baker hesitated, the tension crackled like static electricity, his smirk vanishing momentarily. With a mock bow, he stepped back. "Whatever you say, Captain." The boy hurried away, and Jonathan stared Baker down. "This isn't how we operate," he said. "You're done here for the night. Go back to the precinct." Baker's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. As he left, Reed watched in silence, his expression a mix of conflict and realization. The tension in the precinct had reached its boiling point. Captain Jonathan Miller could feel it in how conversations hushed whenever he entered a room, in the furtive glances exchanged between officers, and in the thinly veiled defiance radiating from Sergeant Baker. Jonathan knew that it wasn't a question of whether Baker would cross the line, but of when. The opportunity came in the form of a high-stakes operation. The precinct had been planning a major drug bust for weeks, targeting a warehouse believed to be a hub for one of the city's most notorious drug rings. Jonathan had spent hours meticulously reviewing the details, ensuring that every step of the plan was airtight. "This isn't just about taking down a drug ring," Jonathan said during the morning briefing. His voice was steady, his tone authoritative. "It's about showing this city that we're capable of doing our job with professionalism and integrity. No shortcuts, no excuses." The room was packed with officers, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Baker sat in the back, leaning casually against the wall with his arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, Officer Tom Reed sat stiffly, his posture tense. Jonathan let his gaze sweep across the room. Most of the officers nodded, their focus sharpening. But Baker muttered something under his breath, loud enough to draw a few chuckles from his small circle of loyalists. Jonathan didn't address the remark, but made a mental note. "We move out at 600 hours, Jonathan concluded. "Make sure you're ready." The operation started as planned, with multiple teams converging on the warehouse under the cover of twilight. The air was thick with tension, and every officer was aware that precision was critical. Jonathan monitored the teams from the command center, his voice calm and steady as he coordinated their movements. Baker's team was assigned to secure the perimeter, a deliberate decision by Jonathan to minimize the sergeant's ability to disrupt the operation. But even this precaution proved insufficient. As the teams breached the warehouse, the situation inside quickly escalated. Suspects scattered, some attempting to flee, while others fought back. Jonathan kept a close ear on the radio, issuing commands with precision. Then came Baker's voice, crackling through the static. "We've got a runner," he said, his tone casual, almost amused. "Pursuing now." Jonathan's brow furrowed. Baker's team was not supposed to engage directly. Their job was to contain the perimeter. He grabbed his radio. "Hold your position, Baker. Do not engage." There was no response. Seconds later, the sound of gunfire echoed over the radio. "Team 2 status?" Jonathan demanded. "We're clear, Captain," came the reply. "But Baker's gone rogue. He's in pursuit of the suspect." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He issued orders for the remaining teams to secure the scene before grabbing his jacket and heading out after Baker himself. The chase led Jonathan to a shadowed alley several blocks from the warehouse. The suspect, a wiry man in his 20s, was cornered at the far end, his hands raised in surrender. Baker stood a few feet away, his weapon drawn, his expression cold and predatory. You think you can run from me? Baker snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. You're lucky I didn't shoot you back there. Jonathan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Drop your weapon, Baker. Baker turned his head, his smirk returning as he saw Jonathan approaching. Captain, he drawled, just cleaning up the mess. This isn't cleaning up, Jonathan said, his tone icy. This is reckless endangerment. Lower your weapon, now. The suspect shifted nervously, his wide eyes darting between the two men. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, every second stretching into eternity. Baker hesitated, his grip on the gun tightening. What are you going to do, Captain? Write me up. You don't have what it takes to handle someone like me. Jonathan stepped closer, his posture radiating calm authority. You think this is about me? This is about you, Baker, about the choices you've made. And right now, you're making the worst one of your career. For a moment, it seemed as though Baker might pull the trigger, but something in Jonathan's voice, or perhaps the presence of Officer Reed, who had arrived moments earlier and now stood frozen nearby, made him pause. Slowly, reluctantly, Baker lowered the gun. Jonathan nodded toward Reed, who stepped forward to secure the suspect. Take him in, Jonathan ordered. And Baker, return to the precinct. We'll deal with this there. Baker's face twisted with anger, but he didn't argue. He stalked off, muttering under his breath. Back at the precinct, Jonathan wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting, gathering the officers in the briefing room. The tension in the room was palpable as they waited for him to speak. Baker stood at the back, his arms crossed, his smirk conspicuously absent. Jonathan stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. Tonight's operation was a success, he began, his voice steady but sharp. But it could have been a disaster because someone chose to ignore protocol and endanger lives. His eyes locked on Baker, who shifted under the scrutiny. Sergeant Baker, Jonathan continued, your actions tonight were not only reckless, but insubordinate. You've left me no choice but to suspend you, effective immediately. The room erupted in murmurs, officers exchanging shocked glances. Baker's face darkened, his jaw tightening. You can't do this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I just did, Jonathan replied, his tone unyielding. You have the right to appeal, but until then, you're off duty. Baker stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The remaining officers turned their attention back to Jonathan, their expressions a mixture of relief and uncertainty. This is the standard we're holding ourselves to, Jonathan said, his voice firm. No one is above accountability. Not me, not you, and certainly not Baker. The room fell silent as his words sank in. The next morning, the precinct felt different. The tension, though still present, had shifted. It was no longer an oppressive cloud hanging over every interaction, but a subtle hum of unease. Officers moved with a newfound sense of caution, aware that the rules had changed. In his office, Jonathan reviewed the day's reports, his focus unwavering. The suspension of Baker was a victory, but it was just one step in a long journey. A knock at the door drew his attention. Come in, he called. Reed entered, his posture hesitant, but his expression more certain than before. Captain, he began, I just wanted to say, I think you did the right thing, and I want to do better. I don't want to be part of the problem. Jonathan nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Then don't be, he said simply. It's a choice you make every day, with every decision. Reed nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. As he left the office, Jonathan allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The tide was beginning to turn, but the battle was far from over. The aftermath of Sergeant Baker's suspension rippled through the precinct like a shockwave. Officers who had aligned themselves with Baker were forced to reevaluate their positions, while others, emboldened by Captain Jonathan Miller's decisive action, began to approach their work with a newfound sense of purpose. However, Jonathan knew that Baker wouldn't accept his suspension quietly. His prediction proved accurate. A week later, Jonathan received notice of Baker's formal appeal. The document was combative, accusing Jonathan of overreach and claiming the suspension was motivated by personal bias rather than professional misconduct. Jonathan read it carefully, his expression unreadable. This is his last stand, Chief Donner said, when Jonathan brought the matter to his attention. The chief's tone was weary but supportive. If you can hold your ground in this hearing, you'll have the precinct's respect. But if you lose... Jonathan nodded. He understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Baker. It was about establishing authority and proving that the precinct could operate under a new standard. The hearing took place in a stark conference room, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Officers from the precinct attended as witnesses, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and thinly veiled allegiance. Baker entered first, his trademark swagger on full display. Dressed in a sharp suit, he projected an air of invincibility, his confident grin designed to rattle Jonathan. Behind him sat a small group of loyalists, their expressions defiant. Jonathan arrived moments later, calm and composed. He carried a single folder, its contents meticulously prepared. He met Baker's gaze briefly, showing neither fear nor anger, before taking his seat at the front of the room. The proceedings began with a review of the charges against Baker: insubordination, reckless endangerment, and violation of departmental protocol. Baker's defense hinged on the argument that his actions had been misinterpreted, painting himself as a victim of Jonathan's ambition to assert control. Baker's attorney, a sharp-tongued advocate known for exploiting procedural loopholes, leaned heavily into the narrative of Jonathan being an outsider. "My client has served this precinct for years," the attorney argued. "He knows the community, the streets, the challenges. Captain Miller, on the other hand, has been here for mere weeks." It's clear this suspension was less about misconduct and more about consolidating power. Jonathan listened without interruption, his face betraying no emotion. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, his presence commanding the room. "This hearing isn't about how long someone has served or how well they know the community," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. "It's about accountability. It's about holding ourselves to the standards we claim to represent." Sergeant Baker's actions on the night in question weren't just reckless but dangerous. They endangered the suspect, the officers involved, and the integrity of this department. Jonathan paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "But this isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that undermines trust, not just within this precinct, but with the community we serve. If we want to rebuild that trust, we can't turn a blind eye to actions like these." He methodically presented his evidence: recordings of radio communications, eyewitness testimonies, and detailed accounts of Baker's repeated breaches of protocol. His arguments were clear, concise, and focused on facts rather than emotion. Jonathan didn't raise his voice or resort to theatrics. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction, the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. The panel deliberated for hours, the tension in the room growing with every passing minute. Baker sat with his arms crossed, his smirk fading as the weight of the evidence became impossible to dismiss. When the verdict was finally announced, it upheld Jonathan's decision to suspend Baker. Furthermore, additional disciplinary action was recommended. Baker's composure cracked. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and menacing. Jonathan met his gaze without flinching. "No, Baker," he said, his tone calm but firm. "It is." As Baker stormed out, his loyalists exchanged uncertain glances. The power dynamic in the precinct had shifted, and they were no longer certain where they stood. The aftermath of the hearing marked a turning point. With Baker's influence diminished, the remaining officers who had aligned themselves with him faced a choice: adapt to the new standards or face similar consequences. Among those beginning to change was Officer Reed. The young officer sought out Jonathan's guidance, asking questions, seeking feedback, and volunteering for assignments that required leadership. His transformation was gradual but genuine, a testament to his willingness to grow. Jonathan, recognizing Reed's potential, made a point of mentoring him, offering both encouragement and constructive criticism. Over time, Reed began to emerge as a capable and conscientious officer, one who could potentially inspire others to follow suit. The community's response was equally telling. Reports of police misconduct decreased, and more residents attended town hall meetings organized by the precinct. Jonathan made it a priority to be present at these meetings, listening to concerns, answering questions, and acknowledging the work that still needed to be done. One evening, a local shopkeeper approached Jonathan after a meeting. "Captain Miller," the man said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and caution, "it feels like things are starting to change. People are noticing. Don't let it stop here." Jonathan nodded, the man's words resonating deeply. It won't, he promised. The precinct began implementing changes that went beyond superficial fixes. Training sessions on de-escalation techniques and community engagement became mandatory. Officers were encouraged to participate in neighborhood events, fostering connections that had long been neglected. These changes didn't happen overnight, nor were they universally embraced. Some officers resisted, clinging to the old ways. But Jonathan remained steadfast, leading by example and holding the line against complacency. One afternoon, Reed approached Jonathan with a folder of proposals for further community outreach programs. "I've been thinking," he said, a hint of nervousness in his tone. "We could do more to build trust, especially with the younger kids in the neighborhood." Jonathan reviewed the proposals, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "This is good work, Reed," he said. "Let's see what we can implement." Reed beamed the approval, bolstering his confidence. Despite the progress, Jonathan knew the battle wasn't over. Baker's loyalists still grumbled in corners, and the scars left by years of mistrust between the precinct and the community couldn't be erased with a few meetings or programs. But for the first time, there was hope. Late one evening, as Jonathan walked through the precinct, he noticed a subtle shift in the way officers carried themselves. Conversations were less guarded, and interactions with the public were more respectful. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start. Back in his office, Jonathan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The faint scar on his hand, a reminder of his first confrontation with Baker, caught his eye. It had healed, but it remained a testament to the challenges he had faced and the victories, however small, he had achieved. As he leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifted to the precinct's logo on the wall. The work was far from over, but for the first time, it felt possible. The weeks following the hearing brought a slow but noticeable shift in the precinct's atmosphere. While some officers still harbored resentment over Sergeant Baker's suspension, the majority began to adjust to the new expectations. Captain Jonathan Miller's leadership, grounded in discipline and accountability, was gradually breaking through the inertia of old habits. However, Jonathan knew that sustaining change required more than policy enforcement. It required fostering a sense of shared purpose among the officers. To that end, he initiated a series of community engagement efforts, starting with open town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns. The first town hall meeting was held in the modest gymnasium of a local community center. Rows of folding chairs faced a podium where Jonathan stood, flanked by a handful of officers, including Officer Reed. The room was filled with residents, shopkeepers, parents, and young people, whose expressions ranged from skeptical to outright hostile. Jonathan began by introducing himself and the officers beside him. "I understand that trust between this precinct and the community has been broken," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to make excuses for the past, but I am here to ensure a better future. Tonight is about listening to your concerns, your experiences, and your ideas for how we can do better." For a moment, there was silence. Then a woman in the back stood up, her voice sharp with frustration. "Why should we believe you? We've heard this all before, and nothing ever changes." Jonathan met her gaze without flinching. "I can't ask you to trust me yet. Trust is earned, not demanded. All I ask is that you hold us accountable. If we fail to follow through on our commitments, call us out, but let's start somewhere." His candor resonated with some in the audience. Others began to share their grievances, stories of unfair treatment, neglect, and fear. Jonathan listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had softened slightly. It wasn't a triumph, but it was a beginning. In the days following the town hall, Officer Reed began to take a more active role in bridging the gap between the precinct and the community. Encouraged by Jonathan's leadership, Reed volunteered to organize a youth outreach program at a local park. The program included sports activities, mentorship sessions, and workshops on conflict resolution. Jonathan attended the inaugural event, watching as Reed interacted with the kids, his initial hesitance giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "Good work today," Jonathan told Reed as the event wrapped up. Reed smiled, a mixture of pride and relief on his face. "Thanks, Captain. It felt good to do something positive for a change." Jonathan nodded, This is how we rebuild trust, one step at a time. Despite these successes, not everyone was willing to embrace the new direction. A small faction of officers, emboldened by Baker's influence even in his absence, continued to resist. Their conversations in the break room were laced with sarcasm and thinly veiled jabs at Jonathan's initiatives. One afternoon, Jonathan overheard a particularly pointed remark as he walked past the break room. "This isn't what we signed up for," one officer grumbled. "We're cops, not social workers." Jonathan paused in the doorway, his presence silencing the room. "You're right," he said evenly. "You didn't sign up to be social workers, but you did sign up to serve and protect this community. If you've forgotten that, I suggest you take a hard look at why you're here." The officers shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, but Jonathan didn't wait for a response. He walked away, confident that his point had been made. Meanwhile, signs of progress began to emerge in the Elton district. Reports of police misconduct declined, and the once hostile interactions between officers and residents grew less frequent. A local convenience store owner who had previously avoided contact with the police approached Jonathan during a patrol. "Captain Miller," the man said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, thank you. Things feel different. Better." Jonathan acknowledged the comment with a nod. "I appreciate that. If there's ever anything you need, don't hesitate to reach out." Such moments, though small, fueled Jonathan's resolve. They were proof that change, while slow and painstaking, was possible. One evening, Jonathan was reviewing reports in his office when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he called. To his surprise, Chief Donner stepped in, carrying a folder. The chief, who had maintained a largely hands-off approach to Jonathan's efforts, looked uncharacteristically introspective. "I've been reviewing the feedback from the town hall meetings," Donner began, taking a seat. "People are starting to notice the changes you've made. It's a good start." Jonathan set down his pen, studying Donner carefully. "I appreciate that, Chief, but we still have a long way to go." Donner nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when you first got here, I didn't think you'd last. I've seen too many good intentions get crushed by the weight of this place." "And now?" Jonathan asked. Donner offered a faint smile. "Now I think you might actually pull it off. Just don't let up. The moment you do, the old ways will creep back in." "I won't," Jonathan replied, his tone resolute. That night, Jonathan decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The streets, though still worn and weary, seemed lighter somehow. The air no longer carried the same sense of tension. As he passed a small park, he saw a group of kids playing basketball under the dim glow of a street lamp. Their laughter rang out, clear and joyful, starkly contrasting the hostility that had once defined the area. Jonathan paused, watching for a moment. It was a small scene, but it encapsulated everything he was working toward. "You did this, you know," a voice said behind him. Jonathan turned to see Reed approaching, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "We did this," Jonathan corrected, his tone gentle but firm. Reed smiled. "Fair enough." Back at the precinct, Jonathan sat at his desk, the faint scar on his hand catching the light. It served as a reminder of the struggles he had faced and the victories he had fought for, both big and small. The precinct's logo on the wall seemed less like an emblem of a broken system and more like a symbol of potential, a reminder that even in the darkest corners, there was room for light. The battle was far from over. There were still officers who resisted change. There were still community members who viewed the precinct with suspicion. And there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, Jonathan felt that the tide had truly turned. The transformation of the Elton District Precinct was far from instantaneous. Like the slow thaw of winter, progress came gradually, marked by moments of triumph and resistance. Captain Jonathan Miller had made strides in rebuilding trust within the department and with the community, but the challenges that remained were a constant reminder of how deeply entrenched the precinct's issues were. Despite the setbacks, Jonathan remained resolute. Every small victory, an officer stepping up to lead a community initiative, a resident thanking the police for their presence, or a reduction in misconduct reports, was proof that his efforts were not in vain. One morning, Jonathan arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, the quiet of the building a stark contrast to its usual hum of activity. On his desk was a file, Sergeant Baker's formal resignation. Jonathan opened the file, scanning the letter. It was brief, terse, and devoid of any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Baker had chosen to leave rather than adapt to the new standards Jonathan had set. Chief Donner entered the office a few moments later, holding a cup of coffee. "I heard the news," he said, gesturing toward the file. Jonathan nodded. "It's done then." Donner leaned against the doorframe, his expression a mix of relief and caution. "It's a win, but don't let your guard down. There are still officers who think like him, even if they're not as bold about it." "I know," Jonathan replied, "but it's a start." With Baker gone, the dynamics within the precinct shifted significantly. Officers who had once been vocal in their resistance became quieter, their influence waning without Baker's leadership. Meanwhile, others who had remained neutral began to step forward, taking on more active roles in the precinct's transformation. Among them was Officer Reed, who had emerged as a strong and reliable ally. Reed's efforts in the community outreach programs had not gone unnoticed, and Jonathan made a point of recognizing his growth during a morning briefing. "Officer Reed," Jonathan said, addressing the group, "has shown exemplary commitment to building trust with this community. Let's take his work as a model for what we can achieve when we're aligned with our purpose." Reed flushed with a mix of pride and humility as the room broke into a round of supportive applause. The changes in the precinct did not go unnoticed by the residents of the Elton district. Reports of police-community conflicts had decreased, and the atmosphere on the streets had shifted from one of hostility to one of cautious optimism. Jonathan made it a point to patrol the neighborhood regularly, his presence a reminder of the precinct's commitment to accountability and transparency. During one such patrol, he stopped by the convenience store where his journey in the district had begun. The clerk, who had been wary of Jonathan during their first encounter, now greeted him warmly. "Captain Miller," the man said, a note of respect in his voice. "Things have been quieter around here. Feels like maybe we're turning a corner." Jonathan smiled faintly. "That's the goal, but there's still work to be done." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "At least now it feels like someone's trying." Jonathan's focus on mentorship became a cornerstone of his leadership. He recognized that lasting change required cultivating a new generation of officers who valued integrity and community. One afternoon, he sat down with Reed to review a proposal for expanding the youth outreach program. "This is solid work, Reed," Jonathan said, flipping through the pages. "I think we can get the funding to make this happen." Reed's eyes lit up. "You really think so?" "I do," Jonathan replied. "But remember, it's not just about the programs. It's about showing the community that we're here for them, not just to enforce laws, but to build relationships." Reed nodded, his determination evident. "I understand, Captain, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Months later, the Elton district looked and felt different. The streets, though still marked by the scars of poverty and neglect, carried a renewed sense of life. Parks that had once been empty were now filled with children playing, and local businesses reported fewer incidents of theft and vandalism. Jonathan often took walks through the neighborhood in the evenings, finding solace in observing the progress that had been made. On one such walk, he passed a group of teenagers playing basketball in the same park where Reed had launched the youth program. Their laughter and shouts echoed in the crisp night air, a sound that felt like hope. One of the teens noticed Jonathan watching and called out, "Hey, Captain Miller, want to play?" Jonathan chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll leave it to you all. Keep up the good work." Despite the progress, Jonathan knew that the battle for lasting change was far from over. The scars left by years of mistrust couldn't be erased in a few months. Some residents still viewed the police with suspicion, and there were moments when old habits threatened to resurface within the precinct. Jonathan addressed these challenges head-on, reinforcing his message of accountability during every meeting and ensuring that officers who faltered were held to the same standard as anyone else. "Change isn't easy," he said during one morning briefing, "and it doesn't happen overnight. But if we stay the course, if we keep showing this community that we're here to do the right thing, we'll get there." One evening, after a long day, Jonathan sat in his office, the precinct quiet around him. His desk was cluttered with reports and proposals, but his attention was elsewhere. He traced his fingers over the faint scar on his hand, a reminder of his first confrontation with Baker. The memory no longer carried the same sting. Instead, it felt like a testament to how far he and the precinct had come. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he called. Reed stepped inside, a smile on his face. "Just wanted to thank you, Captain," he said, "for believing in me, for believing in all of us." Jonathan nodded, his expression softening. "You've earned it, Reed. And this precinct is better because of officers like you." As Reed left, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the precinct's logo on the wall. The challenges ahead still loomed large, but for the first time he felt a profound sense of hope. The battle wasn't over, but the foundation for something better had been laid. And for Jonathan Miller, that was enough. The changes at the precinct became a model for other departments in the city, sparking conversations about reform and accountability. Jonathan's name became synonymous with integrity, and his work inspired others to follow in his footsteps. The Elton district, once a symbol of distrust and decay, now stood as a testament to what could be achieved with perseverance and purpose. And as the city continued to evolve, Jonathan remained steadfast, knowing that every step forward was a step worth taking. The story of Captain Jonathan Miller's fight to transform a broken precinct and a fractured community is one of resilience, integrity, and hope. It reminds us that meaningful change often begins with a single, steadfast individual willing to confront injustice head-on, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Through his unwavering commitment to accountability and his determination to rebuild trust, Jonathan not only reshaped the culture within his department, but also rekindled a sense of faith in a community long abandoned by those meant to serve it. This narrative highlights the importance of leadership by example and the courage to challenge entrenched systems. It also underscores a vital truth, that trust and unity are built slowly through consistent actions, transparency, and the willingness to listen. In Jonathan's journey, we see a reflection of the struggles faced in communities everywhere, where perseverance and purpose can turn even the most cynical skeptics into allies. It's a story that resonates beyond the precinct walls, a powerful reminder that while systemic change is daunting, it is far from impossible. It requires patience, collaboration, and a relentless belief in the possibility of a better future. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. Let us know about your own experiences or stories of transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.